All right. Well, here we are. We had a really great discussion last week about self-worth theory, and we talked about a host of topics. Imposter syndrome was one of those, and we're going to do a follow-up discussion about that. But we thought it would be good to talk about a book that you wrote called Life Beyond Grades, Designing College Courses to Promote Intrinsic Motivation, given that self-worth theory was really core or key to you and the other authors and what you were advocating for. So is it okay for you just to give a brief description of the book and the argument and what you were hoping to achieve through it? Awesome.
Absolutely. So first of all, my co-authors, Martin Covington, he's since passed away, but my mentor and a prominent researcher in self-worth theory. And I'll tell you a little about how he got to that in just a moment. And my other co-author and mentor, Linda von Hunne, who for many years has led the development of graduate students at UC Berkeley and their teaching, which is how I met her. In any event, so Life Beyond Grades, the title suggests, it's evocative. Students hear it and they say, I want to know more about that. Faculty go, yes, I get it. My students are so focused on grades. So this idea that we observe in education, including higher education, of a focus on grades on the part of students. And even beyond that, a grade threat because of grades. And it's an important distinction because we could focus on grades in our aspirations to get good ones. And many people say that's what they want. They say, I want good grades. If you scratch the surface, uncover that, what you often find is they fear bad grades. Motivationally, those are very different orientations to academics, if you can see that, right? And being in a state of fear, anxiety, aversion to a bad outcome is very different than pursuing and immersing oneself in the desire to achieve a positive outcome, a positive grade. So the manifestation of getting a good grade, like I don't want to get anything less than an A minus, or I want to get an A or above. Conceptually, those are the same. You want an A, but motivation, they're very different. One is based upon approach motives, one is aversion. So this is an observation we see in the world. Marty been studying this among children and adolescents and brought his work to college, in college teaching, and he had a 10 or 20-year research project to do that. One of the things he learned in his research was that you can teach people to think creatively. And so not surprisingly, your creative problem solving class. It is possible to do that. And many people were skeptical, but he had a very rigorous study, showed that among children. What he found, he and his researchers found, is that when the students were in the study, so to speak, they would exhibit creativity. And that was an interest. But when you remove the framework, they weren't. So then the question was, and this was back in the 60s and 70s, Marty said, well, what's going on? Why is that? And what they landed on was this idea that intrinsic motivation, fascination, curiosity, a love of learning was the essential ingredient for creativity, for resourcefulness in the face of difficulty and pursuing creative solutions to problems. And in fact, that love of learning, Marty wanted to call the book Love of Learning. And Linda and I said, that's a little too far for many people in higher ed to imagine we're going to create love of learning. But that is really the solution. Intrinsic motivation, one kind of which is an inherent love, fascination, passion for learning. So on the one hand, that's crucial for creativity. Another thing that intrinsic motivation does, and hence that's why the subtitle, we're trying to, we as educators, can we promote intrinsic motivation? Not can we create it, but can we promote it? Can we create conducive environments? It's an antidote to fear. It's an antidote to anxiety and to threat. So if we're immersed in something out of curiosity, out of fascination, out of the desire to grow, we're less fearful. So it's a way to counteract the understandable grade focus, right? It's to shift the focus and the emphasis off grades solely and focus and put some emphasis on the desire to learn for its own sake, and to alleviate the emotional dimension of grade threat, the fear that gets in the way of deep engagement. So it's hard to engage deeply when our nervous system is in a state of fear. It's hard to engage deeply and and take away transferable knowledge, right? Outside of that moment to just deal with the situation when we're in a state of fear, anxiety, or threat. So that's kind of the biggest idea, that intrinsic motivation has this unique properties that have effects on us as learners. The way we engage, crucially, in academic context, we engage more deeply in a different emotional state. And then that has different outcomes for what we learn and what we take away, and then are able to use in the future. So intrinsic motivation shapes the engagement. The engagement is crucial, what you get out of schooling. And we can see that in contrast. And I think in my own experience, I was really grade focused, and I was really focused on not getting less than in something. And in college, and I got that, exactly that. My goal was to get an A- and do as little as possible. And in college, and I graduated literally at this 3.72. And mostly what I took away from college was grades and a transcript. Literally. Now, I learned some things along the way, and I actually was intrinsically motivated and curious. I was also a big procrastinator. I was avoiding. So when I got forced into the moment of studying and learning, I was into it. So I picked a major that I liked. All due respect, Matt, my roommates were all economics majors, and they hated their majors. Well, that's not true. One of them did. Two of them did. And so they would ask me, hey, tell me about what you're learning, because I don't want to deal with mine. And that was actually really beneficial to me. But the point is, I actually did have some intrinsic motivation. And when I was engaged in the action of studying and learning, I often could lose myself in that and was fascinated. But I wouldn't get into it because I was fearful. I was avoidant. And so I procrastinated and put all my studying to the end. And so I could only get so much out of it because I was in a state of fear, trying to get as good a grade as possible. I didn't have time to then follow up an interest or pursue it, what was curious, interesting to me or fascinating. In any case, so that's a personal story that's related to this as well, to kind of illuminate. So the book then, to pivot, I can see you wrote down something to say, but I'll just say the book then says, hey, can teachers, can faculty and post-secondary primarily actually cultivate intrinsic motivation among students? Can we do that while we still grade them, while they're still interested in grades? Is that possible to reconcile these two things? And we say yes. There's things that you can do in the design of your course, the curriculum, the instruction, especially the way we assess students, that on the one hand can reduce these fears that are obstacles to deep engagement, and we can help students tap into, draw upon their own intrinsic motivation. I don't know that we can create it. Maybe we can try to spark it. But I would say it's not that we're saying, oh, it's faculty responsibility to create intrinsic motivation. No, that is not the claim of the book. The claim of the book is we can inadvertently, as instructors, create obstacles and create conditions where students think they cannot act on their intrinsic motivations. And then I'll end with a brief anecdote and turn it back to you. And Princeton students say that. They'll say, the grade is a necessity. Learning is a luxury. If I'm reading something or learning something that's interesting to me, I think I don't have time to pursue that because why? Because I have to get a grade. Now, I guess I'm going to say one more thing. Now, why is it so important for you to get those grades? And they'll usually say material consequences for my job, but if you scratch that, there's also some recognition that it has to do with who they think they are, how they're perceived by other people. And that's where the self-worth framework comes in, because it explains what motivates people so powerfully to study and pursue that out of passion, intrinsic motivation, but also to work so hard out of fear to avoid, and then also to disengage completely, which is procrastination.
That was great. I have there's so many paths to go down, but I wanted to ask initially about assessments and grades, because in a way you're not necessarily advocating for getting rid of grades.
Definitely not.
Because you're saying that in a way they can play a positive role. Can you just maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. One is a well-designed grading system is crucial kind of feedback for students. It also is important feedback for the instructor. People are motivated by extrinsic rewards. And that is a feature of human beings. People want to achieve. People want to attain. People want to be recognized. The problem isn't that per se. The problem is when that becomes the sole focus. On the one hand, that I learn only to get recognition, and or the problem of grades comes when that they represent something I'm fearful of, that I'm in a state of fear. So the first one is very strategic. That's what I was. I wasn't super afraid as a student. I was like, how do I get an A? But that leads often to a superficial engagement. I'm thinking, what's the quickest path to get to that grade? Not how do I learn deeply fundamentally? How do I understand myself and the world differently? Can I grow and build skills? So another way to give an example of that is in college, I wrote a lot of papers. I almost always got A's, and I almost never got better at writing because I wasn't focused on how do I get better at writing. I was focused on how do I get an A out of this assignment. That's a superficial treatment. Do you see that? And then I also had some fear, but so the fear also leads us there. So our position isn't that we should get rid of grades for a variety of reasons. I've given you a couple. Also, that's just not very realistic in most contexts. And then lastly, I would say we could even say that grades and other extrinsic rewards and punishments have beneficial properties and consequences. So for instance, a grade in that can narrow our focus. And at the early stages of thinking and learning, that can be counterproductive. It can make us look at the surface. How does it appear? But to get something done, convergent thinking is quite useful. Otherwise, we never finish that paper, that project. So we need sometimes an external force to help us come to completion. We're not always thinking divergently. I think, Matt, this is my problem. Divergently and creatively and exploring the process and being absorbed in that. Yeah, but if you want to impact people, you probably got to finish it. Turn it in, get it out there. And so rewards and punishments, which are external, extrinsic rewards, extrinsic motivations, can be very beneficial.
Right. I just think even if you're intrinsically motivated, there is a sense in which you want, well, is this any good? Not just what do you think about it, but like, if I was an engineer, some part of that assessment is, are my capabilities and ways and processes adequate or show a mastery? And you want that done, even if it's superficially done through grades. That's in a way preparing me for when someone's life could be on the line based on how well I built that bridge or something else. So
right,
yeah. So that was really cool. And it was, it's fascinating is that it'd be easy to say that if you're just solely focused on grades for the grades, that you're not being creative, but in a way you are using your creativity in just a distorted way that's unhealthy, because you're looking for signals, all these clues on how to get that A, so you're devoting all this energy in a way that doesn't allow you to develop, but you're still using your creativity, which is it's revealing and tragic at the same time, I guess.
Yeah, maybe there's a distinction I can make that could help for this. So I make a distinction between being purposeful and being strategic. Now, strategy includes purpose, but the question is, what's the aim? So if the aim of strategy, so kind of, again, I was really good at this as a student, reading the clues, what's going to be emphasized, getting inside the professor's head, what kind of questions will be asked. And that's not mutually exclusive with being purposeful and deep learner, but you can get a good grade without being purposeful. So you might think about reading these contexts and creatively using your problem solving at a strategic level to maximize the outcome. Purposeful, I think the word's connotes something a little different, and it's motivated by our purpose in a different way. So our motivation becomes a little different. So my purpose is to enhance myself, to build my capabilities. My purpose is to be impactful to others, the engineer that you were talking about. Not simply get a grade from them. but to have them give me feedback and recognize my contribution. Those are different. And those are different outcomes, and therefore, they're motivated by different kinds of motivations, and we might even say aspirations. So I don't know if this is helpful to make a distinction being purposeful, that draws on different kind of motivation, and then strategic. But they both are creative problem-solving processes.
Yeah, no, and I wasn't trying to, I was more just saying how amazing we are as humans, that we have these incredible abilities to be, and we are exercising our creative juices, but we just often don't use them in ways that are enriching to ourselves.
Great.
Yeah.
Great phrase. I think enriching to ourselves. So this might be the distinction between some of the things we're saying, and some people think, oh, Nick, you're a sort of a productivity guru. And I'm for productivity. I'm for being efficient. I'm for being strategic, but not simply for the purposes of being productive. So I would say purpose over productivity. If you're purposeful and then skillful and strategic on the way, then you'll be more impactful.
Right.
Meaning you'll achieve your purpose even more. Not purposeful, not untethered productivity, untethered to one's goal or one's impact on other people.
No, I that's a really good point, because I think it's easy to create kind of a business mentality. And how do I create an environment where people are more productive? And I can understand that as someone who's, started businesses and led businesses, but it's treating people as machines. Can I get this person to maximize their productivity, but I might be burning them out, versus someone who's really feeling alive and thriving and really into their work. That person is going to be really super productive, but also have longevity, because that is life-giving in itself. Right. So yeah.
Enriching and nourishing. Now, we go even further. There's a quality dimension to productivity that I don't think can be approximated without this kind of motivation. And there's lots of evidence around. There's a platform website that has all these quotes and memes and talks from Nobel Prize winners, highly productive people, achieved at the highest level. There's no question. Listen to how they describe their work, and especially read between the lines of their motivations. They often don't have the language typically of a motivational psychologist, but if you listen, it's obvious. You can see it with this framework. They don't feel that there's any kind of contradiction between being intrinsically motivated and achieving an outcome and an insight that has practical applications in the world and even gets this reward above and beyond that. They don't see any contradiction there. They see those two things as integrally related, actually. But they often point out and emphasize these other kinds of motivations, of being fascinated, of trying to understand something, have a genuine question. So not only, I think, the justification that you have, which is short-term productivity is often at the expense of long-term engagement, and that has consequences and real material costs for corporations, right? Turnover of your best people, that experience, that wisdom, that there's real losses to that. But there's also a qualitatively different kind of work and productivity that happens when someone is operating from different kinds of motivations. And the environment can stultify that. If you're overwhelmed by the amount of work, then that can easily lead you to work at a surface level. You can achieve what appears to be good work. You meet the observable observational criteria, but you don't go beneath, below, beyond. I just made that up. Sorry if that sounds silly. That really leads to growth, right? That leads to innovation, that leads to insights. And maybe that sounds a little fluffy and airy-fairy, and it is a certain kind of ineffable quality of what it means to be fascinated by something, or it's not very direct in its response. From hearing it from me, so don't listen to me. Go to these people who have achieved the highest levels, and what do they say?
Yeah, I actually really appreciate that, because what you're pointing at, it reminded me of Michael Polanyi in this book called Personal Knowledge, and he was talking about passion and really devotion, I think is a better word. And that's what you're saying. Like, you're fascinated, you're devoted to this. And so it's one thing to be kind of productive for the long term, but in a way that could be kind of in the box, kind of, you're just kind of humming along, versus the people who really have been innovative, been creative. There's a the devotion allows them to think deeply and to penetrate to levels of thinking about whatever they're thinking about that others haven't. And that's a struggle, because you have to break through all these kind of perceived or conventional ways of thinking about something. And there's a struggle, but you're so devoted, and you feel like there's a hidden truth there, that you're willing to dedicate yourself to that. And then from that come the breakthroughs, the ahas, the eureka moments. And Polanyi was someone who really, explored this, Michael Polanyi. So I think that's a really great, but I'm glad you made that reference to the Nobel Prize winners, because you're right. They were just fascinated, and they really gave of themselves, like really, just yielded themselves in a way to these problems that they saw. And then from that passion, from that devotion, they were able to make these incredible insights.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we could go back to the book. I feel like this is a rich vein. I'm not sure where we should go here. What do you think, Matt?
Well, yeah, let's go back to the book, because I just feel like there's so much there to mine for because we always want to get to the so what.
Yeah.
So is it okay for me to ask a question, or do you have something you want to?
Please do.
Yeah. So I'm curious. Well, I have two questions. You can take them in order. I'm curious about the fact it was published, what now, like 8 years ago, 7, 8 years ago?
That's right, 2017.
Yeah. So I'm curious what you've learned since then that you might want to have put into the book. Maybe nothing, but and then secondly, I'm curious about the impact of the book. Like, what it's one thing to advocate for this, it's another to see people embrace it and implement it in the classroom or the lecture hall. So I'm not sure which question you'd rather address first, or
yeah, I'm not sure either. Let me start with the first one, because okay. I'm fearful that I won't come speak to it. So
I'll come back to it, or the second one.
Yeah. Well, I think, and if you'll indulge me, I think it's worthwhile to put the book and my relationship to it, and maybe Marty's too, but my relationship to it in terms of my growth and development based upon my intrinsic motivation, my fascination and passion. So I arrived at studying self-worth theory. It's kind of two levels. One is I wanted to learn how to write and publish, and Marty was doing a seminar on writing a book, and he invited graduate students to participate in that. And it's a very practical orientation on my part. I'm like, writing is a struggle. I want to learn how to do that. I'm going to take this seminar. It's about what? Motivation. Okay, fine. But then I got in the class and I read his material, and I'm like, boom, oh my God, this is something that's speaking to me in a way that I had never read anything in a college class that did. So that blew my mind. And that says something about fascination. Now, this work is a personal journey of exploration. Very quickly, it became, wow, I can really help other people too with this. And so those are two really powerful motivations, intrinsic motivation, and I might call an internalized motivation. But I would put that in a larger aim then. So I think since the book, I worked with a colleague, Dr. Laura Murray, who is a positive psychologist trained at Penn, and we did a deep dive into well-being theory, and I was kind of moving toward that. At the same time, as we've talked about before, I was studying Buddhism. So, and to put it briefly, I think I would try to bring a more coherent, or not say more coherent, a somewhat different model of human action and how people change and what an instructor, a coach, or guide on the side could do to facilitate that change. So I think Life Beyond Grades, in many ways, is saying people are intrinsically motivated. The context of the course can be an obstacle to that. How can we minimize those obstacles and create conditions where students can tap into their motivations? I might add something like, but students are socialized thoroughly to not be intrinsically motivated and to be highly attentive to these structural features, grading, and what have you. Maybe we could spend a bit more time thinking about what's involved in making such changes. And I think both positive psychology and, frankly, Buddhist psychology help us to do that in the latter in particularly concrete ways. But this is just an observation in my experience. So I started, if I think back to my in pursuit of graduate school, I was really interested in what are the cognitive processes involved in college reading. It's a pretty, then I said, well, actually reading is kind of like learning, and you don't have to just read and learn. You're always in a class. So there's a social culture. So that expanded my view from cognitive to socio-cultural. And then I met Marty and I said, whoa, but why are people doing this? Oh, there's a motivation. I felt like my framework kept getting bigger. And then I started to think about well-being. At Princeton, the students are capable, but they're not happy and they're not very, what's going on here? And so that my view kind of kept expanding. Does that make sense? And so I think it has continued to expand since the book project, which goes back far more than, we worked on it for 4 or 5 years. So, and what I just described to you is a reflection, I'd say, of the last 10 years, really thinking hard about how people change their own behavior in a very holistic way.
Yeah, actually, I was gonna ask you about that. So I'm glad you referenced that, because it's risk. Like you said, they've been socialized to focus on grades, and that by getting and these higher Ivy League schools and whatnot, they've been rewarded, and it's been reinforced over and over and over and over again. If you do something in this way, you will be rewarded and you will move ahead. You will advance. And this is, it's like on the side of the road saying, nope, don't go down that path. Come down this, which looks like this little dirt path, do not enter kind of sign. So what have you seen that help students make that change? Is it kind of like, I would assume it's something along the line of, I'm burned out, this just seems hollow. Anything else, or is that at its core?
I mean, there's a lot. I think that for a lot of us, pain is necessary, or some kind of suffering, to a shift in perspective on the world and ourselves. Some unmet expectation, and we have to. And then that both gives us an insight that what we're doing isn't effective, and then a engine energy for change, because I want it to be different. So I think that is often the case, but maybe also needs to be coupled with some vision of possibility. So I actually had a cool interaction with a student just the other day at Princeton, and he had a kind of a mystical he's studying biology and doing research in a lab that he's looking at chicken embryos and doing some thing but he went out, he said he walked out of the lab and he just kind of had this moment of kind of piercing the superficial reality and thinking about how the world worked from this molecular biological point of view. And it filled him up and it gave him this fascination. He's like, oh, this is why I'm doing it. This is possible. I can see the world in this new way, and it's amazing. Now, he practically wants to be a doctor, but he said it just totally changed how I was approaching what I was doing. So that gives me chills thinking about it then. It's amazing. Maybe I had some moments like that myself. So, can you script that? Can you plan it? I don't know. You have to be open to it. It's not just about not being fearful or not focusing. He has to have learned something, have had introduced to him some vantage point on the world and somebody's signaling to him in a lab environment, hey, it's this way of thinking, theorizing conceptually beyond the surface that is what this discipline has to offer. It's how you'll make a contribution, right? If you think about, for instance, illness and health, the way the average person does as a doctor, what do you add? No. You have to have a different vantage point on reality. So if you're going to do something with math where you're creating something like an engineer or you're analyzing something like an economist, then you can't think about your calculus the way you did in high school, because that's not what you did with it. What you did with it is you solved the problems that were given to you on the test. That is not what mathematics is. Certainly not for a mathematician who see it more as an art. But it is also not that for any working inquirer, any working problem solver. And that is a fundamental shift. That this thing I'm learning is not what I thought it was. It's not for what I thought it was. So can we, I think reading these Nobel Prize stories or having certain experiences and noticing that, maybe introspecting and reflecting, hey, when have I been really fulfilled? When have I had a qualitatively different kind of experience of learning and the acquisition of knowledge? What were the conditions? What were the features of that? So those might be ways, I think that's what you're asking, is how do teachers and or students themselves or people more generally tap into that and change that orientation and stance? I think it is somewhat ineffable. It seems kind of mysterious and woo-woo. So that process is hard to put words on, but the fact that it's happened millions of times is indisputable. The fact that that change is crucial to attainment in the world is demonstrated by the Nobel Prize winners and the professors over at Princeton. If you ask them why they do what they do, it's usually rooted in this fascination, this growth, this expansion, and a desire to help other people. And hey, right, to impact the world in a positive way. And it's kind of nice to get tenure at Princeton and make a lot of money and be recognized. They're not incompatible. They're not incompatible. But how to effect that? I guess what is why it's so hard. I'll stop here. A lot of it resides in the individual. So that's why it says promote intrinsic motivation, not create. There's still the agency of the individual. There's something about the subjective, the personal, the organism that nobody from the outside can, with predictable reliability, create in you. You can resist, right? If you want, you can miss it. You can not get it. And there's a certain thing that it can only originate in you. So it doesn't matter what I do. Some part of it can only originate in you. I think that's my explanation of why it's so hard to describe how we can evoke that. What do you think?
Well, I think that's right. I would say that it gets frustrating because you kind of want a formula for creating it. Given our kind of like behavioristic approach towards human behavior, we want it where if we do X, Y, and Z, then that creates this effect in people. And if it doesn't, they're like, well, that was useless. Right. Versus what you're saying, promotion, modeling, all these, you create this environment that encourages, but it's ultimately up to the individual, because they have their own, because they have this inner world that we have to respect, and there's this inner dialogue, this inner dynamic that you and I have obviously talked about all the time, self-relationality and self-worth. They're grappling with their self-worth, and they have to come to realization that a life dedicated to seeking extrinsic rewards, like a professor who was just, all they want is tenure and make a lot of money, they're going to burn out, and they might stick with it, but they're going to be miserable, most likely be miserable and not a fun teacher, versus a professor who is fascinated with their subject. And part of that fascination is, I think, is a desire to communicate that and have others participate in your joy. And that's kind of, so I think I think we are wired to be intrinsically motivated. We are wired to be creative problem solvers. It's up to us as individuals to, at some point, allow ourselves to be that, because society is kind of running in a different direction. And, you have to just recognize that and know that there is going to be a cost. There might not be as much affirmation at times as you would want. It wasn't like these Nobel Prize winners were getting encouragement every single day. Maybe some, but a lot of times they weren't, because they were going against the grain. And they had to challenge perceptions and assumptions in their field. And so there's discord, there's conflict, there's suffering, as you talked about. So it can be a lonely path, the path least followed.
Lonely and confusing and hard to see and counter to the message. So I think that's one thing I just want to, I try to not blame students for not being intrinsically motivated and a level of learning. It sounds very judgmental, and students sometimes hear that, oh, you're saying I'm supposed to love learning for its own sake. And that's right. And I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's useful, but it's not obvious to you that it's useful. It's useful to get exactly what you want. So, which is attainment, but often attainment, and this occurred to me this morning as I was reading, success succeeds, it comes after, but it's not necessarily, it ensues from our focus. It comes after, but doesn't necessarily the thing that we should be looking at, right? Eyes on the prize is not good advice, actually. Eyes on the process. If you put your eyes on the process, then your success ensues. It succeeds after you've done that thing you've mastered. So I don't know if I like these little word games. Sometimes they tell us something about reality. I'll give another about the role of the self. When people really get into something, get in flow, they talk about losing themselves in something. They lose their self-consciousness. They lose their sense of self. What does that self want? That self wants attainment. But in that moment, you lose that self and you're immersed, absorbed by the activity. So we want task engagement. If you want to succeed, be fully immersed in the task where you forget all the considerations and contingencies. That sounds really counterintuitive in the practical world we live in. But if you talk to people who succeed, they do that. Another approach, I'll say one more thing, just using this word, so hold on, is, this term, another term, so losing yourself, another term is being selfless to others in the service of altruistic. I'm selfless act. We often admire such people. They put the service of others, and that could be communicating what they've learned, right, to others. And again, it seems counterintuitive in the me world that we live in, that if I want to be happy and successful, I actually give myself over to something that's not about me. It's about a cause. It's about a calling. It's about serving others. This is often, for many people, the bigger, more powerful motivation. And it's not only is it more powerful, it also then often connects you with other people. And it can then take the attention off me, right? And you might think, well, if I'm a self-conscious person anyway, so the focus on me is actually not helpful. I do better when I'm focused on other people. And I think we are wired for that. Now, we can't forget we are people in the world. We have to survive. But many times, a selfless motivation is a more effective motivation, right? So people who study and persist through med school to serve others because their parent or uncle had a medical issue, they are acting not to be a doctor, but selflessly to serve others, that by being a doctor, but not to be a doctor. And there's an important distinction.
Oh, I was just going to say how, the idea of losing yourself, that, I think that's really great, because often the motivation can be, without us really realizing it, can be to self-preservation. And through that, we're trying to manipulate the world for our sense of self. Like, so grades, like I'm manipulating, I'm getting signals, so I'm trying to manipulate things, move this dial, write this paper, do whatever this to get that acclaim that I want, that that signal that I'm good, versus as you're saying, like when I don't need that, then I'm less manipulative. I'm less about my preservation and sense of self. And there's a, in a way, there's a trust that I can let go of myself and be immersed, so that myself isn't like such a concern. Now, you don't like that you're still yourself. I mean, you're still there, and you're still, in a way, you're even when you're in the state of flow, um, you're really fully alive, but you're not in control of it in a way that you might be when you're trying to manipulate your environment.
Or you may not be feeling the need to control it.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Because a lot of times we can't control it anyways, but we feel the need to control. But in that moment, we lose ourselves, and that self has the need to control it. Or so one thing I would say, just to be clear, it's I don't bring a moral judgment. So I don't think it's a bad to have these feelings and to want to achieve, because I don't want to say that. Well, number one, I don't believe it. I think that that's a part of being a human being too. But they can also evoke shame and guilt. I mean, what do you mean I'm not supposed to try to be a doctor? I'm not supposed to be good? No, that's not the point. The point isn't that that's somehow bad. The point is that that's not as useful as saying, how do I grow? How do I serve? I think that, and then what are the motivations, right, that come from those orientations?
I would say, instead of like useful, because it sounds utilitarian, would it be better to say it's unhealthy? Because it's like, if I'm focused on the accolades or the titles, that's it's going to impact everything, myself, the quality of my work, and whatnot. So it's not, I don't know. I'm just trying to think of, like, useful. I don't know. Is that?
Let me put it this way. Let me give an object.
Right.
Useful, though I'm resistant to the health, because that invokes a medical model. That's something people are sick, wrong, pathological. But I take your point. I think you're right that I don't have the best words for it, and but I can make them a little bit better. So let me make it a little bit better. It's useful to your desire for attainment. And it's useful for your desire, your fundamental human desire for well-being, which includes happiness.
Right.
In that sense. I would also argue it's useful in the service of others, which certainly can be understood as a moral dimension. But I take your point. Useful can then kind of circle back on itself, and you're just replacing one useful utilitarian approach to another. I guess that's my nod to people wanting to choose utilitarian means. That's okay. I have no problem with that. It's not necessarily what motivates me all the time, but it is a kind and a legitimate kind of motivation. I would never say it's the only kind, and maybe I wouldn't even say it's the ultimate kind. But in the work that I do, I often am trying to appeal to people in ways like, if it's not useful, why am I going to do it? So because we're talking about behavior change. Again, that doesn't mean it's the only reason to do it.
Okay. Well, is it okay just to kind of leave that, just because we're running out of time? And we did want to talk about the impact of the book. And then at the end, I want to save a little bit of time for so what, and just recommendations you may have based on the book for anyone who picks up and reads it. Available now at whatever, Amazon and your local bookstores. So what, how about the impact of the book?
Well, I think there's a few layers. One is people hear the title and like, wow, yes, they feel a validation that the issue, faculty especially, feel that that's the issue in higher ed. It's the kinds of and quality of student motivation, and that leads to engagement, and that they're seeing this superficial engagement as grade focus, as fear, and they see that it's the absence of intrinsic motivation. And so I think very intuitively that gives words to their observation, their experience in the world. I think a lot of those questions of engagement were eclipsed by the pandemic and the consequences. So I'm not sure it's as much of a focus as it was. And then concretely, what are the impacts? Certainly the book has sold. I've done lots of workshops and trainings, and I've gone places and people have seen the TED Talk and they hear about the book and they're like, you're getting at something that I see is operating, but I don't have a language for it. And I also don't necessarily have a theoretical framework or the research basis. So I think if you listen to faculty, which I do, they are talking about these issues, but as very layman's terms. And I think most of them don't even realize there is a research framework based that is addressing that, right? So we see something similar. They'll talk about academic culture as if it hasn't been studied by anthropologists. It has, in a very systematic and thorough way. So it's kind of, you know what I mean? Like there's a discourse around it that's not as rigorous as say about cognition or neuroscience. There is. So I think that's illuminating for people. Like, oh, this has been studied and it's been studied for many years, and people study motivation. You got theories of motivation that are rational and reasonable. And yes, that's true. And I don't mean to be that sarcastic. I'm not saying that. How would you know what is out there and been researched unless you've taken a look? So I think those are some of the impacts. And then concretely, it talks a lot about grading, and that's a big topic in higher education, and it's influenced some of that discussion to some extent. Yeah.
All right. So, well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, just personally, I know how much I enjoyed the book, and it was really great just to kind of help me when it came out. I think we were still kind of getting, I mean, we knew each other, but just to kind of understand where we're coming from and how our respective research really complements each other. So that was great. So, okay, so life beyond grades. So what? If you had some last thoughts, or for a professor or for a student or a parent of a student, what are some so what's for them?
Well, that intrinsic motivation has these unique properties. It's very powerful. It could be transformative in our experience and our outcomes, what ensues, but it can be very fragile. And this is counterintuitive. It can be squelched and squashed by environment, by pressures, and intrinsic motivation that are external, but also our internal frame approaches and stances. So if we can, when I was a parent, like when I was working with teachers, I always tried to walk into my parent-teacher conference with the idea of saying, my kid's curious about this and enthused about it. How can you help them act on their curiosity? For instance, that'd be a practical thing. But I think the main point is, this takeaway is, so it's powerful, unique properties, unique consequences, but fragile. How do we nurture and cultivate that as parents, as teachers, as coaches? It's not easy, but if we don't have that as an objective, because it's fragile, then we almost certainly will not attain it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to say that it's not easy, it's fragile, because I think in the end it takes a lot of courage, right? You know, as a professor to teach that way, because you'll have students who are like, well, I just want to, you know, how do I get an A?
Yeah.
And then as a student, you may be in a class where it's about getting the grades, and just being curious and engaged in that way can mean that you're devoting your time in a different way than you may want to have allocated it from a different motivation. And then as a parent, you know, it's just tough, because you know the herd mentality is to think more about achievements, and so to go against that and really foster a different way of approaching studies in your kids is hard. Go ahead.
I just want to say, I'm not opposed to achievement. I don't think this approach leads to not to achievement. I think it leads to achievement ensuing. There's a difference between pursuing achievement and pursuing passion, fascination, growth, development, meaning, purpose, and letting achievement ensue. It follows from.
Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah, because again, we're not saying like, you know,
Yeah, give up on achievement. Like, I'm gonna let my kid, float
Yeah,
around.
they all have to be hermits living off, up in the mountains, doing poetry and art, which they might be called to, or that might be their life, but that's not what we're saying. It's just how do you enrich, and I think again, I think both of us realize we are wired, we are created, we are meant for a life that is rich in experience, and we're just trying to get that. And it's not exclusive of the accolades and achievements that we have talked about. It's just to say if we make that our primary motivation, then it can lead to less than what we were meant for.
Right, counterintuitively.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Nick. Well, thanks so much. Really great discussion. I think next week we'll
soon.
Soon we'll be talking about imposter syndrome, and we've got a whole bunch of other great topics coming down the pipe. So talk to you then.
Thanks, Matt. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.